Have you heard of the far-right bogeyman? He lives in your computer, on the internet. He is most prevalent on a very popular website you may have heard about, the YouTube. He finds you through black magic, or in this case, white supremacist magic, called an algorithm. It sucks you deep into the deep, dark wormhole of hating all the ethnics. That's where the bogeyman finds you and takes over your soul. Sounds like fantasy to you, doesn't it? It's because it fucking is.
This is a film about psychological warfare. A specific type of warfare designed to distract, misinform,
but trust me,
and anesthetize the brain.
The increasing threat of the far right and its rise is a myth. It's a horror story, a fabricated and overblown bogeyman used by the media, politicians, and even the police and security forces to get what they want. The far right is the fear machine's new best friend. It scares into supporting censorship. It jump scares us into calling for deplatforming. It horrifies us into wasting our time reading convoluted clickbait articles. It makes us plop our little pants so hard we allow those who are supposed to protect us clamp down on our freedoms. It may be hard to remember that only a couple of years ago the bogeyman was the Islamic extremist, the Muslim terrorist, the jihadi, whatever term you prefer, that's who it was. We've been caught up in such a bombardment of far-right fear-mongering that we struggle to see through the fog towards the most recent history. For almost 2 decades post 9/11, the Islamic bogeyman was the biggest threat to civilization in the known universe. Forget climate change. The Islamic bogeyman would eat an entire power station in China and spit out its tired workers on a fire of burning infidel heads. The Islamic bogeyman was the best friend of the fear machine. They loved him. He was everything you needed. He was ruthless and terrifying, but also mysterious. He could be your neighbor, your postman, your children's maths teacher. He could even have been you without you even realizing it. The media didn't need to find news when he was around. He would create it every day, bombing and beheading and being a right naughty little evil entity. The government, political opposition, security forces and police force, or the establishment if you like, though apparently calling them the establishment is a telltale sign you're far right now, so yeah. They loved the Islamic bogeyman too. They loved the media fear machine. It was a perfect and beautiful union.
The unwinnable war on terror announced by these degenerates.
After 9/11, the Labour government introduced the Anti-Terrorism Crime and Security Act of 2001. This was an amended version of the 2000 Act. Provisions put in place included enabling the Home Secretary to identify, detain, without charge or trial, foreign nationals who are suspected of terrorism, limiting the appeals of foreign nationals detained under these circumstances, granting the police and security services, including foreign agencies, the power to ask public bodies to disclose the personal records during terrorism and criminal investigations, enabling law enforcement agencies to freeze the assets of suspected terrorists at the start of an investigation, enabling communication service providers to retain data to ensure it can be accessed by law agencies. Let us not forget that if you are suspected of terrorism, you could be indefinitely imprisoned without charge or trial, though that only happened if you could not be deported. However, anyone could be arrested and held without charge for up to 14 days. Since its amendment in 2001, it has been adjusted to and been gifted additional provisions. As it currently stands in June 2019, some main provisions include extend the offence of inviting support for a prescribed organization to cover the expressions of support that are reckless as to whether they encourage others to support the organization. Clarify that the existing offense of displaying in a public place an image which arouses reasonable suspicion that the person is a member or supporter of a prescribed organization. This also covers the display of images online. Update the offense of obtaining information likely to be useful to a terrorist to cover terrorist material that is just viewed or streamed over the internet rather than downloaded to form a permanent record. Amend the Terrorism Act 2000 so that the detention clock can be paused when a detained person is transferred from police custody to hospital. Introduce a power to stop, question, search and detain an individual at a port or border area in order to determine whether they are or have been involved in hostile state activity. The new powers given to the authorities should have been scarier than the actual threat of the Islamic bogeyman, but it wasn't. Some were scared, some gave warning. Once you gave these freedoms away, eventually they could use it on everyone. This was dismissed as crackpot conspiracy theories by internet nutters, so they ignored these warnings. But no, the fear machine was strong. People clapped and nodded in agreement, especially those that were really scared of the Islamic bogeyman. Years later, those who speak out against Islamic extremism have found themselves being persecuted by the very law that they would have once supported. That's how it works, don't you know? Fear lasts longer than love. Never forget that.
Right, we're inside a mega mosque in Bradford. We've got about 10 activists here. We're here to deliver this literature, Muslim grooming leaflets, and also our British Army Bibles to the Imam. And we're going to tell him in no uncertain terms, this is our country, and if they don't do something about Muslim grooming gangs in their community, then they will suffer the consequences, because we're not taking this lightly anymore. We're sick to death of our girls being sexually molested and groomed by Muslim grooming gangs. The Bible. Jesus Christ.
Jesus Christ our Lord.
Jesus Christ our Lord. We want to save you from hell. We reject the false prophet Muhammad and read the Bible. Okay?
Pray for Jesus
Have a nice
Christ.
day.
الرقة 25 يوليو 2014 جثث عناصر النظام الذي تم قطع رؤوسهم من
In
قبل
2014, the scariest of Islamic bogeyman was on the rise. They were called ISIS. You may have heard of them. They were bigger than the Beatles for about 3 years. You can open a newspaper, click on a news link, or even overhear a conversation without hearing about ISIS. ISIS were terrifying. A hardcore nihilistic Islamic nutter train marauding its way from Iraq, headed into your home to decapitate your children in their sleep and put the video footage up on YouTube. The media loved ISIS. They were sexy scary. Never before had a terror organization used new media so effectively to spread their message of fear. On almost a daily basis, media outlets shared yet another horrific video created by ISIS showing decapitated heads, people drowned in cages, homosexuals pushed from rooftops, and much, much more. The relationship between mainstream media and ISIS was like a sick romance, each forever grateful to one another. ISIS got to terrify us all with their lurid propaganda. The media got the traffic they needed to stay financially afloat and relevant. The media just couldn't help themselves. ISIS was the fear machine's bestest friend. And whilst the media pushed and shoved this propaganda down our throats, people began to get very, very scared and very, very skeptical about Islam in general. And the scrutiny of Islam didn't come without merit. ISIS attracted British citizens to join their cause. Some of them were school children. Our neighbours were now potential terrorists. Unlike during the period after 9/11 and before ISIS, we were living in one of the most relatively peaceful times in decades. The number of terrorist incidents in Europe especially was very small in comparison with previous decades, and yet a whole generation has grown up in absolute fear of Islamic extremism and terrorism. Who made them feel this way exactly?
Oh my God, god. What's going on? What just happened? What's going on? Oh my god! What's going on?
When ISIS emerged, terrorist incidents started to skyrocket. Whereas before attacks had been more isolated, such as the London bombings in 2007, suddenly attacks were rampant. Now the fears embedded into our subconscious by the fear machine were actually legitimate, and during the migrant crisis of 2015, it was unsurprising that people were not so willing to welcome so many people dedicated to the Islamic faith with open arms. By 2017, terrorist attacks across the world, and especially Europe, seemed like a weekly event. It became a case of, I wonder who's going to get it next? And it wasn't just the same old. A whole variety of horrid methods were used. Mass shootings with automatic weapons, trucks driven through peaceful crowds, bombs exploded at concerts full of children, a mass knife attack in South London. What we were constantly in fear of for over a decade was happening again and again. And those that were supposed to protect us, namely MI5 and the police, scared us even more by saying there were 20 to 30,000 suspected jihadis in Britain alone, and they didn't have enough money and resources to handle it. Yes, it was the government's fault people were being killed in this terrifying manner. We were all scared. Tensions were high. Britain First emerged during this period, but Britain First were, and always have been, very fringe. You may have seen a few of your pals share a Britain First meme on Facebook, but most likely, and I have investigated this, they had no idea what Britain First is. It just sounds like a statement rather than an actual organisation. That did not matter, as I, and many others believed that the far right was on the rise. What was actually going on was the rise in a call for tighter border controls, the assimilation of immigrants, and an end to mass immigration. This was not a fringe far-right rhetoric. This was voiced by both the major parties and their leaders, David Cameron and Ed Miliband. Yet somehow, even wanting to discuss these issues would lead you to being labelled a racist, a xenophobe, or an Islamophobe.
When I was running for the Labour Party leadership, I said that one of the areas where we had got things wrong and needed to change was immigration. I think quite simply, we became too disconnected from the concerns of working people. We too easily assumed that those who were worrying about immigration were stuck in the past, unrealistic about how things could be different, even prejudiced. But Britain was experiencing the largest peacetime migration in history, and people's concerns were genuine. Why didn't we listen more? I think at least by the end of our time in office, we were too dazzled, too sanguine about globalization, too sanguine about the impact of globalization and indeed migration on economic growth. We lost sight of who was benefiting from that growth, whose living standards were being squeezed.
But while I've always believed in the benefits of migration and immigration, I've also always believed that immigration has to be properly controlled. Without proper controls, community confidence is sapped, resources are stretched, and the benefits that immigration can bring are lost or forgotten.
A whole generation had grown up not remembering what it was like before the post-9/11 world, both Muslim and non-Muslim. As a non-Muslim, it became very difficult for you not to look at the other without skepticism and suspicion. And how could you not? The extremist minority would commit horrific acts, and we would see, hear, and read non-stop accounts of their actions. We would be fed speculation, terrifying data. We would learn about every aspect of these terrorists' lives, how and where they got radicalized. There was not one type of extremist. They came from all walks of life. Academics to the jobless, to people who had only just converted to Islam. We would also hear again and again about triggered Muslim outrage over works of art, whether it was a silly cartoon, a play, or a comment on social media. They would make so much noise and be so angry, this vocal minority, and the media would amplify it up to 11. And in turn, those vocal minorities' anger over art eventually became violent when gunmen stormed the offices of Charlie Hebdo and massacred cartoonists and writers. The world wrote in their social media bios, "Je suis Charlie," and changed their profiles to the French flag. People were terrified. But what you noticed is that if you vocalized your concerns and criticisms of the faith, you were labeled the worst label of all: racist. You were cast aside and told to shut your mouth.
How do you feel about the scriptures that say you should, as a Muslim, you should behead me as I'm a non-Muslim? How do you feel about that?
That's not my belief.
No, but how do you feel about the scriptures that say that?
It doesn't bother me at all.
It doesn't bother you at all. You don't acknowledge that Jesus Christ is the Saviour. Jesus Christ died to save every single one of you. And do you know what you do? You belittle him and call him a prophet. You worship a false prophet who claims to have some sort of connection with Allah. You do. You have your prophet on a pedestal. Your prophet who was a paedophile and a warlord.
Okay, listen, you're changing the subject.
Britain First were amusing loons who wandered around crappy towns with crosses yelling about Britain being a Christian country. They believed fighting religious extremism was best done by yelling about Jesus in the streets. That is why no one took them seriously, except the establishment. It's no secret that the authorities didn't want Britain First making any noise. When the establishment does not like you, they will get you. Just look at the craze. People who have committed far worse crimes have served less time and been released early. But the Krays were and still are folk heroes, worshipped and admired by people of all walks of life. The establishment didn't want them on the outside being worshipped. They kept them in jail until they died of cancer. Britain First are certainly nothing like the Krays, but they made enough noise to get on the radar. Britain First are a joke. They are scared of Islam, and the funniest thing about all this is that the establishment, the police and security forces are scared too. They don't want these extra problems. Britain First presented no threat to anyone. The 2-bit clown collective led by a potato man who make memes and small marches did not require the amount of energy put into silencing them. But it happened. They made an example of them, and no one, myself included, cared, because they are a joke, and who wants to kick up a fuss over a joke? Between 2014 and 2017, terrorist attacks across the world escalated to new heights. Yet we carried on, being just as scared as when we had less to be scared of. But in 2016, when attacks were at a peak, a new threat was gaining more and more coverage by the mainstream media. The far right, and the very elusive alt-right. Due to a permatan billionaire's silly comments on Islam and Mexican illegals, the world was suddenly turning super racist and xenophobic apparently. Then Brexit happened, and all the Remainers suddenly despised the concept of democracy and said that over 17 million people in the UK were just racist. This many racist people should lead to some sort of hideous genocide, you would think. But it has not. But that doesn't matter. The fear machine had found itself a new best friend, and the timing was perfect. As ISIS's power and influence started to decline, so did terrorist incidents across the world. 2018 was one of the most peaceful years in a long time, except in Afghanistan, but they had one of the bloodiest years since the beginning of the conflict in 2001. But don't worry about all that. The media did not find it interesting anymore. People needed to be scared of something, and seeing as so many people were terrified of Islam because of them and populism was on the rise, they could create a new narrative using those elements as a perfect building block. As Islamic extremism and terrorism declined, so was the influence of mainstream corporate media. In fact, not just its influence, its value was rapidly declining. In the clickbait era, mainstream media had their work cut out for them. Time was once on the side of journalism, and therefore integrity, to a certain degree, was something of value. But when clicks means cash, that option becomes unsustainable. The gatekeepers found themselves outgunned by hard-grafting nobodies in bedrooms with just a camera and an eye for research. They had their own deadlines. They did not have bosses or investors. Their overheads were minimal and their reach was equal. The mainstream media corporations suddenly found themselves no longer competing with each other, but with something else that they didn't understand and did not see coming. The age of outrage was in full swing. At some point it had been discovered that article headlines that enraged people were more likely to be shared and clicked, and therefore, in order to stay afloat and ahead of their new, sprightly competition, they needed to generate as much rage as possible. No longer was fear of terrorism the talk of the town. No, it was outrage. And the one person who knew how to utilize this to devastating effect was Mr. Donald. He made the mainstream media corporations so much money he should have been given shares. He probably bought shares, but what he had also become was an enemy of the mainstream media for calling them out over and over and over again. But what Donald didn't realize is that the mainstream media had found their new Bin Laden. The ever-ominous presence that reminded us all that the world was full of dangerous extremists who looked up to him. Donald was the face of the new far right. The far right was the new Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And the far right was the fear machine's new best friend. Suddenly, article after article told new tales of far-right Nazi white supremacy. Frogs and hand gestures were suddenly terrifying, and if you used them, you were a Nazi and you needed to be silenced. People who had grown up only hearing of the terrifying and horrid elements of Islam that had been amplified by the mainstream media were Nazis. They voiced their concerns. They were labelled, mobbed on social media, and deplatformed. Some of these poor schlubs were even thrown in jail. And every time a story was shared, it outraged people. And they shared that story. And media corporations breathed relief as they could pay the rent that month. The fact that so many people are terrified of Islam because of the media hype and now the very subject used by media to terrify others is certainly ironic. But more disgusting than ironic. By the time that is right here, right now, the far right is everywhere. People who were once considered moderate or just plain right-wing are now far right. We right now live in a time where a cartoon frog is a symbol of pure evil, where a hand gesture, universally used for simple communication, will have you sacked. And most ludicrous of all perhaps, we live in a time where a gay, flamboyant, catty Jew who is married to a black man and believes in reparations for African Americans is called a Nazi. Let that one sink in for a moment. One of the problems with the far right is that, unlike Islamic extremism, it has a very poor track record in terror. There just aren't enough bodies to whip up the public consciousness into a frenzy of fear. But for some reason, that does not seem to matter now. We live in a very blind time, where the actual realities of the world are obscured by some kind of lunacy. It seems more and more people use the same talking points, use the same examples, and regurgitate the same narrative. We become oblivious to what's actually real. Why would a million voices say that the sun is purple when it does not look purple? It must be me. No. It's not you. This time it's actually them. Whereas the death count for Islamic extremism is the size of a respectfully sized city, the body count for far-right extremism is the size of a post-it note. But the more and more they keep going on about the same thing over and over and over and over, the numbers do not matter. Because let's face it, by numbers alone in the Western world, if every third person who is white is a white supremacist Nazi racist, that's a lot of people to be wary of. With that lodged deep in the back of your mind, it does not matter that they just keep talking about the murder of Jo Cox, the one and seemingly only murder on behalf of the far right in the UK in recent memory. The amount of time that they bring her up, it might as well be another victim each time. But what of the other issue? We have the new Bin Laden. But who is the new ISIS and Al-Qaeda? Well, in America, you've had all sorts of loony racist groups who are still around, and the alt-right, which was claimed in part by Richard Spencer. But in the UK, our golden age of neo-Nazi groups is long gone. That doesn't matter, because National Action exist. The fact that they exist is enough for them to be used as a poster pin-up of terror. Well, who are National Action anyway? They are certainly more dangerous than Britain First could ever be, but, well, have a look. That's right, the numbers are correct. The best example of an extremist group in the UK they can latch onto, but it's enough. The fact is, if ISIS had National Action's numbers, no one would have ever heard of them. Barely half the crappy little town where they may be based would have heard of them. No one would care, hardly anyone would be scared. But what makes this even more curious is that not only are the desperate dying mainstream media having a new love affair with the far right, So are Britain's security forces. All of a sudden in 2018 they decided that the apparent 20 to 30,000 jihadis living in the UK were no longer a threat, but the biggest threat was the far right. That's correct. They actually said that. Where exactly did the 20 to 30,000 jihadis you couldn't deal with because of lack of funds suddenly go?
MI5 agents will be tasked with tackling right-wing terror for the first time amid concerns that radical threats are on the rise. That's as Philip Hammond announced an extra £160 million for counter-terror in today's budget. Far-right extremism will now be designated a major threat to national security, along with Islamist and Northern Ireland-related terror. MI5 will take over the intelligence gathering, and police will take over when it's time to disrupt a plot or make arrests. 4 alleged far-right plots have reportedly been thwarted since March 2017, with 100 investigations ongoing. The Chancellor has said he recognises policing is under pressure, with many MPs making representations on this. Home Secretary Sajid Javid will review the force's spending power when he announces the police settlement in December.
The conspiracy theorist in you will have many questions about the fear machine. Does the establishment, the government, the security services control the narrative perpetuated by the mainstream media? Or does the mainstream media have an influence over them? What we know is mainstream media is dying, and the government has an unhealthy desire to continuously reduce our freedoms. The conspiracy theorists warned us about this happening. We dismissed it as fear-mongering lunacy. How amusing it is that the conspiracy, loon, fear machine has more legitimacy to it than the mainstream fear machine. I would say the mainstream media, the government, and security agencies all benefit from the fear machine. Therefore, it is a marriage of convenience. The idea that the free press should call out power and expose the truth is lost on the mainstream media. Their desperation to remain in power as the gatekeepers of selective information is too strong to really care about any noble cause. The government can silence dissent as it pleases, knowing the powerful and far-reaching media will support it because the narrative says it's silencing evil. The dangerous path began almost 2 decades ago. This is what many people asked for, and now it's turning on them. The fear machine influenced so many individuals to become very critical and fearful of the Islamic bogeyman. And then one day, they decided to label those that were scared of the Islamic bogeyman, the bogeyman that should be stamped out. If that doesn't bother you, and make you question the role the mainstream media plays in our society, then you must have missed something. The fear machine keeps rolling along. Alternative voices that gain more reach than the mainstream media are being silenced and deplatformed day after day. But people are noticing. And as the fear machine shows itself to be ever more desperate, jealous, and hateful, the more they expose themselves for what they truly are. The fear machine is looking scared. And that's the kind of irony I enjoy. The fact that the fear machine made so many people scared and then turned them into the thing to be scared of is not irony I enjoy. I was angry. I was fearful. I, like many of you, looked up to the powers of the media and the government, believing they had our best interests in mind. But they don't. And much like discovering a best friend is secretly your worst enemy, I was upset at first. But when you think for yourself calmly and independently and clearly, you realize you're not so scared of not having them in your life to rely on. I have not hate. I have not fear. I am just very, very, very disappointed. Like North Korean propaganda shows how crazy America is, we are shown other nations and how oppressive they can be, how their media frame stuff, how their liberties are taken away. Yet like the North Korean videos, they are showing an oppressed people how bad it is in other lands, deflecting from the fact that their people are oppressed. We are perhaps no different. The mass media is controlled by a small list of huge corporations. They are being slayed by independent creators. They can't beat them with quality content. So they perpetuate a bogeyman to smear and discredit them and the platforms that made them. Through fear of the far right, they encourage people to stay well away from these creators and denounce their platforms. A last gasp maneuver of desperation. It's time to just reject the fear machine.